Disclaimer: the contents of Studio 151 podcasts and the TU Communication Disorders Connection podcast do not represent the views and beliefs of the University of Tulsa and the Mary Kay Chapman Center.
Hello and welcome back to the TU Communication Disorders Connection podcast. This is your host, Reagan Scholl. I am a first-year graduate student, and this is my first time hosting the podcast. And today I have two special guests joining me in the studio. Our first guest is Hannah Turner, who's a second-year SLP graduate student at the University of Tulsa. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited.
Our second guest is Grace Cheifetz, who is a multilingual SLP working at a pediatric outpatient clinic for Spanish-speaking children. Grace, thank you so much for being here. It's really great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Hannah with some questions for Grace.
Okay, Grace, before we get started with these questions, it's super great to see you again. For those of you guys who don't know, before grad school, I was an SLPA, and Grace was actually my supervisor at Therapeuta's. So this is really exciting because she's been someone who has helped me grow so much as a clinician, and just getting to share this podcast with her and let her share that wisdom with you guys is really exciting for me.
And it's so exciting for me to be here with you because I got to watch you grow and become such an incredible bilingual clinician, and I welcome any additional input you have about your experiences as a bilingual clinician.
Okay, Grace, when did you start learning your second language and then your third language?
I got really lucky. When I was getting ready for kindergarten, my mother knew she wanted me to be bilingual. She tried to put me in a bilingual preschool, which wasn't available, but there was a bilingual classroom, like an immersion program at an elementary school near my house that was in both English and Spanish. And so for the first 3 years of elementary school, I was in that classroom learning both languages. And then I just developed a passion for it, and I started really taking classes in middle school, and then it just kept going from there, and I never stopped until I got my my bachelor's degree in linguistics and Spanish.
That's awesome. So you've been studying Spanish most of your life then?
More or less, yes. There's definitely a break in there between from 3rd grade to 8th grade when my middle school offered it. But growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, it was kind of all around me, but I'm not going to claim I really spoke it until I started classes later.
That's still really cool. When did you start learning French?
So in high school, I needed an extra elective my junior year, and I was just really loving languages. So I had room for French 1, so I was like, yes, let's do it. The French program at my high school left a lot to be desired, and I'm not blaming anyone, but I basically sat in that first level class, and while I spoke no French, I kind of had the idea of how a Latin language worked, and I was bored. And let's be clear, this was not a hardcore program. So I taught myself French that first quarter, and then I think it was second quarter they put me in French 3. And I am not claiming I spoke 3rd year French. This is just the level of discipline that my high school was giving for French. So, and then I got really lucky, and I spent a summer in Paris after junior year, and then I just kind of kept going, learning it as my third language, off and on whenever I got the opportunity.
That is really cool. I can tell you're super passionate about languages, and just knowing it's been woven into your life is really impressive. Okay, so when we move on to your career, so how is your treatment or your diagnostic approach different with monolingual children versus bilingual children?
Always a great question, and I am so glad that we get to talk about it. So with monolingual children, you only have to think about one language and the features of that language. When you have bilingual patients, you have to not only think about the features of that language and how they might differ from English, but also how the two languages influence each other. You also have to think about the cultural aspect of the other language, because a way you might coach a English-speaking parent can be radically different than how you coach a Spanish-speaking parent, whether or not you speak that language itself. So I definitely am always thinking about that when I go in, and especially with assessment, you're really trying to piece out what is just a difference or lack of exposure to, in this case, English, versus what what Spanish they're exposed to, how much Spanish they speak, if they have a preference for one language or the other. And this is English, Spanish, right? Like, obviously, we get so many other languages as well. So all of those are kind of in your head when you're both assessing them. And then once you've determined that they have a true disorder, your treatment has to reflect features of both languages. Like, you can't teach something that just occurs in the one language. You want to teach... you want to use an intervention or select a target that's going to generalize into both.
Okay, so you also mentioned you've worked with other languages other than English and Spanish. What other languages have you seen in your clinic?
So not only in my clinic, but also here, I was briefly in a school here in Tulsa, and there, because it was in the Jenks district, I did get to see Burmese. And then at my clinic now, I've evaluated children who speak Hmong at home, Mandarin, and I did do a Vietnamese one in Jenks as well, I believe. And I actually had one in Serbian a couple years ago here. That was a surprising find.
That sounds like that would have been really interesting. So then, with those languages that you don't speak, like, what strategies can be used to conduct assessments in a language someone does not speak?
There are, I'm going to say 3, but maybe it is only 2. Let's find out where we land. There are a couple things that you absolutely need when you're assessing a language you don't speak. One is you need an interpreter, and ideally that interpreter is in person so that you can train them. Like, you want to have a assessment in mind. Maybe that's like a language sample, a way to elicit something. There's this free resource from the Leaders Project, I believe, .org, that has these school age language assessment measures, SLAM cards, and they provide everything you need, and they have them available in maybe around 20 languages, more or less. Yes.
That's awesome.
It is so great.
It's a great resource.
Yes.
Awesome.
Plug for SLAM cards. I have no financial interest. So you can train the interpreter for how to administer this very quick and easy assessment, get your sample, and then go over with the interpreter. Okay, so like, how did they answer this question? Would you count it as correct? What errors did you see? What does that tell you? Obviously, an interpreter is not as qualified as we are, which brings us to our next resource, which is making sure you have resources for the phonology of that language, the syntax of that language, and how they differ from English. So like, the word order might be different, or they might not have the same morphemes. Like, Mandarin doesn't mark for plurals. It doesn't have articles. Like, things just get kind of assumed using other words. So like, you say in Mandarin, yesterday, jump, like, to say that it happened. And so a Mandarin speaker might not use that ED because that's not something they're familiar with. And that's that carryover. So those are 2 of the things you need. Obviously, we don't live in a perfect world, and you're not always going to have an in-person interpreter. Sometimes we have to use something called a language line instead of an in-person interpreter, which is where you call a number and then someone interprets over the phone. Not an ideal situation, but when you have some of those rare languages, if you don't have someone in the family who can interpret in person either, you work with what you have. And so then it really is about listening, knowing your IPA, your world IPA, I know, scary, or at least the IPA familiar with that language, and then you can kind of parse out, okay, what was this? What was that supposed to be? And really consulting with those parents, like, what do you think this was, and what did it mean? Or there's also a great resource from the OLA clinic. It's actually one of my friends from grad school runs a clinic in Los Angeles, and she has a list of like first 50 words in multiple languages, and so I like to print that out and be like, which ones do they say, and how do they say them?
So cool.
I know.
That's an awesome resource. Yeah. Wow, I did not know about that. What was the name of the clinic?
OLA, like HOLA. Clinic.
That's really cool.
I'm gonna definitely check that out. One of the things I've loved about getting to see you do some bilingual assessments in real time is that you're so thoughtful in going into it. I remember one day us sitting at lunch and you were like looking through articles of like the syntax and like the phonology of like random languages, just because I think you had something coming up, or you just always are looking for new information. So when you're trying to get information about like the phonology or just the various characteristics of the language that you don't speak, do you usually just start with an article, or like where do you start with that?
I'm going to be real. I go on Wikipedia. Wikipedia's got it down. I just type in language, phonology, language, syntax, and they usually have it. It's pretty awesome. Hot tip.
So since we just talked about everything with how to conduct an assessment with language that you don't speak, how do you determine if someone is bilingual? Like, how do you truly determine if they are like a speaker of a second language?
That can be so tricky because I'm sure everyone here has had the experience of parents say they speak insert language here at home, and that kid has never spoken anything but English to you.
Right. Yes.
Even when you also speak the language. I 100% have kids at my clinic where they would rather die than speak Spanish to me. And I'm like, are you sure? And then the second their parent comes in the room, they turn to the parent and speak full Spanish. And I've been trying to pull it out of them for like an hour of my eval. But because they know I speak English, they ain't gonna do it. And so I think it's important to never assume they don't speak the language just because they deny it. I've known adults who say they do not speak their home language, and then I catch them on the phone speaking that home language to their parent.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's like a comfort issue sometimes. I think there's sometimes like a shame issue depending on kind of the world's opinion of that culture, that language, or just bilingualism at the time. And so I think if the parent says they speak another language at home, I would believe them. I feel like that's the best thing you can do, and take their word for it too. Like, do they speak this language to you? And sometimes they'll say, how many words can they put in a sentence in that language? Okay. And then parents will be like, oh yeah, it's like 1 or 2 words like at a time. But I know they're speaking like 5-word sentences in English. It doesn't mean I don't assess that other language. I do, especially for the receptive part. But it gives me a sense of, okay, I'm not like missing anything huge expressively.
Right. No, that sounds incredible, and I feel like as you're talking about it, it like makes sense, but it's always really helpful to hear somebody who is doing that every single day and like how you actually, I guess, accomplish those things. I feel like it's really interesting just to think about all of the things that go into assessment and working with bilingual individuals. I've always been super fascinated by it, and that's just a really in-depth answer, and I love that. So I know you touched on this briefly before with one of your other answers, but would you mind elaborating on like what factors should be considered when selecting intervention targets or goals related to a second language?
Yes, definitely. So like I said, I always want the targets to kind of complement each other. So when we're considering what's going to generalize, if we're talking about articulation, we want to select sounds that occur in both languages. So like kind of a past controversy, actually it's still really a current one, is like whether you teach TH,
yep.
like to an
absolutely
to a Spanish-speaking kid or a Mandarin-speaking. I mean, TH is so rare. Like, it's, right. I'm not going to say it's only English, but sometimes it feels like it's only in English. And so you just kind of have to be like, well, it doesn't occur in all these other languages, and it's not affecting intelligibility that much in English. So, like, why don't we pick something that will generalize? Like, oh, S occurs in both languages. And insurance is up on that too. Working in a clinic, they know when I select targets, even for my English dominant kids, if I select one that they think doesn't occur in Spanish, they'll kick me back. They'll say like, oh no, you need to be selecting one that applies to both, even though your kid's speaking English. But yeah, so that's important, getting the best bang for your buck there. And then of course with language, like I said, some things don't occur in the home language that do in English, but there are so many concepts that do. Even if like word order is different, having the concept of a complete sentence is really important, just like that, you know, subject, verb, object, even if it's in a different order. Like you want to make sure, do they have all those parts, even if the word order they give you is in their home language? You're like, hey, that's a complete sentence. Good to know. Maybe I need to move on.
That's really helpful. So I have another question regarding how you interact with parents of children who are bilingual, or maybe the parents just speak Spanish and the kids are speaking Spanish and English. Like, how do you go about partnering with them in a way that carryover is actually happening?
I super love this question because it can be so hard, especially because in my experience, as these kids get older, they get more English dominant and their parents don't understand what they're saying. Right. And like they speak some Spanish, but their English gets stronger. And then that does create this like, not a break in the bond, because obviously the bond between your caregiver and child is so strong, but it does make it harder, and that's something that monolingual people who live in the language-dominant country don't have to think about at all. And I have 100% had so many parents where they're like, I know they're saying stuff to me and I can't understand it because I know it's in English. Sometimes it's just that it doesn't make sense, but often it's just that it's in English. And so a couple things thinking about like with building trust with parents is being like, letting them know you do not have to try to speak Spanish. Parents will say that. They'll get misinformation that they should be speaking English, and I like to break that immediately. No, all that matters is a good language model in the language that is strongest for the parent. If you speak Spanish to them and they reply in English, it is what it is, but they need a good language model. And so I like to tell parents, like, for example, I do a lot of dialogic readings, which if you guys aren't familiar are like when you read a picture book, but you're not really focusing on the words, you can, but you're really talking about the pictures, still telling a full complex story, but you're not worried about the text. And so I tell parents, hey, if they're bringing home books from school that are in English, ignore the words. Doesn't matter. The pictures will tell you. Right. Read it to them in Spanish. Don't worry about what it says below. And so then if the child brings home a book, they can use these dialogic readings where instead of focusing on the text, because the book is in English, if it has pictures, they can use the pictures to tell a full complex story in their home language. And then they're still giving them that really great input. And that's so important. And so I tell them all the strategies we use you can do in your home language, and you don't have to feel bound by the original language of the materials if you know what you're doing. And as an SLP, we have to collaborate with parents about what that looks like and answer their questions and take away that shame and that guilt they feel for not speaking the language of, the country they're in.
I feel like what you said is just so useful, but I have another follow-up question. How do you explain to parents that bilingualism is not causing their language delay? I feel like as someone who has worked with other bilingual clients, sometimes parents will say, oh, it's because they're hearing Spanish and English and that's why they're not talking. So how do you approach that conversation?
Yeah, that is a conversation I've stumbled through in the past, and I think I landed on something I like. Get back to me in a year, and I'll be like, that was nonsense. I have something better now. Right. I like to tell them, oh, I understand that is a thing you've heard, that it causes confusion, because I like to validate that. Yes, that is a thing that is floating around. Mm-hmm. And then I like to say, actually, for children, when they hear language, they just hear it as language. So if you're saying, even if you're mixing languages, if you're like, hola, cat. To them, that's all just language. Right. And so they're not confused. They're like, I have heard words that apply to this situation, and I know how to use them. Eventually, they start picking up, oh, my mom does not understand these words, and this lady prefers these other words. And they start to pull the system apart and make those, and distinguish them. But when they're getting all that input, they're to them it's just language. Right. It's like if you randomly say, oh, I saw beep beep, for a car, of course. You're not confused. It's a sound. It's not, The idea is you're not confused. You're like, oh, I have assigned a meaning to this thing I saw, and therefore it's all language. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that I always like to tell parents is some families in Europe especially might get exposed to 3 languages. So they're getting multiple different languages, even sometimes in Latin America, if they speak an indigenous language at home, but the majority language is Spanish. These kids pull it apart, and then you end up with these trilingual kids by the time they're 3. They're not confused. They're not delayed. They just have different words for different things, and eventually they pull it apart.
That's awesome. I feel like that's such an important conversation to have with parents, especially when it just comes with maybe not really having a lot of knowledge of what we do as speech pathologists, so I feel like that's really important. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different things, but how has being multilingual helped you serve your clients better, whether they're English, Spanish speaking, or you've mentioned some of the other languages that you've worked with?
I think it helps understand how stuck you can feel in a moment when you can't think of a word. I mean, obviously we all experience that even in our first language, but I feel like, and I also feel like this helps me build a bond with my parents, or the parents of my clients, is that sometimes I just do not know a word. And I can circumlocute, or I think we've all experienced this, where you can picture the idea and no word comes to mind right. in any language you speak. And I feel like parents, we're such an authority, and I think it sometimes helps to kind of let down your guard and be like, I have to be honest with you. I don't know how to say this. And I do think being multilingual gives me that perspective of the clinic is my environment where the dominant language, quote unquote, is not my home language. And so the cognitive effort it takes me to do my job is the same cognitive effort these parents are facing every day out in the community. And that's way more than my, 7 hours at work with still surrounded by people who speak English. So it really gives you that perspective.
Wow, you're making me rethink things too. That is incredible. Okay, Grace. So what is one piece of advice that you would like to leave for clinicians working with bilingual clients and their families?
I think the most important thing is that you can never assume that they can't do something or don't understand something. One thing that stuck with me and has haunted me for ever since I heard it in this career was I inherited a kid who was fresh out of Puerto Rico. We received testing from the Spanish that said he was average. But when I met him, he was receiving speech in schools. And I was like, how do we get here? And so I looked at his testing. They had tested him in all English when he got here. He tanked it. They placed him in speech. And so I brought this to people's attention to be like, whoa, we need a full reevaluation. If you think his communication is impacting his school progress now that he's been here a couple years, and you still think it's like communication delay related, like we need a full bilingual evaluation. And someone said to me, but doesn't he just seem delayed? And that haunted me.
Wow.
It haunts me still. It was so awful. And I was just like, I'm sure I seem delayed to my families in Spanish. I tell my families all the time, I'm really smart in English.
I feel that's so hard. Like, I promise you that I am different in my native language.
Yeah, and then I also feel like I'll test these. Sometimes I'll have kids where they're totally English dominant. They're not speaking any Spanish to me necessarily, but I'll be giving an assessment where it just naturally has prompts in Spanish. They miss it in English. I ask it later in Spanish, and they're like, oh, 100% immediately. And I'm like, can't assume. Some concepts are just more solidified, and so I cannot assume just because I haven't spoken English to this kid for a couple years, and I know they've been in school a while, doesn't mean that Spanish is not in there with some additional.
All right, thank you for sharing that story. That also I feel like is going to haunt me from like a secondary area because I feel like those personal stories are so helpful because it gives you like a defining moment where you can think of like, I never want to be like this. That whole answer was really insightful and helpful. So when I started with you as my supervisor, I was still actively learning Spanish. And so I remember trying to communicate with parents and like establish that rapport. Do you feel like it's still difficult for you to establish rapport with like new patients and new clients like now that you have spoken Spanish for like so many years?
It's definitely easier now. I wouldn't say it's ever going to be like the easiest thing in the world, but it did definitely get better as my Spanish has improved. And also I have to say, while I consider myself a bilingual clinician, I am so in this job saying basically the same kind of group of things every day that then sometimes I go to a Spanish-speaking country and they want to talk about a thing that like, dang, I've never talked about that in Spanish. And suddenly I'm like, am I bilingual?
I feel like too that I've actually had the privilege here to do some bilingual assessments as well as like full Spanish, which I'm really grateful for, as well as getting to do that at Therapitas this summer because that was one of my offsite placements. And I feel like one of the things as someone who's like learning how to do bilingual assessments, it's really hard to just go into it and feel as confident as you do in like your native language. And sometimes I feel like there might be something that you miss or you wish you had asked the parent, but I think that's the important part of remembering that like the eval is not everything, and if this child does qualify, you're going to get to have that relationship, ask more questions, understand more things about backgrounds, because there were a few times that I wish that I had asked the parent where they were from, just for like vocabulary, because like you know the difference between different countries from like Latin America, they use different words for like the word dog or pig, and sometimes like I could be giving a model that's unfamiliar to a child when in reality they need something else. So I feel like that's something that gives me peace as someone who doesn't know what they're doing most of the time trying to figure this stuff out. But do you still feel like that happens to you sometimes?
Oh, first of all, I'm like nodding vigorously behind this microphone, y'all. Yes, it's like the differences in vocabulary is just such a big thing. There's also just slang, even in like, I speak mostly like Mexican Spanish, and sometimes still my families will say something and they'll like kind of elbow me like, you get it? And I'm like, I do not. And so I'm
definitely not.
Yeah, and it's like a thing their kids said. They're like, they said this, and I'm like, which means? And so, yeah, that's going to be like a never-ending like chasing that, like trying to get it all. And so bringing up that is so important. But the other thing you bring up, which is so critical, is that everything is not determined by the eval. And when we say that, I think what I really want to emphasize is not everything is determined by a score on an assessment.
Absolutely.
Because your assessment should be telling you what the functional problems are, not whether this test said they could complete an analogy. Like, if your kid bombed something on the PLS-5 because they didn't know their colors, but everything else was looking great, and you do an item analysis, and you're like, dang, this kid just doesn't know their colors. And you're like, do what they need speech for this. They're about to go to preschool. So I do think, as you said, like, you have another opportunity, or if you do a real proper evaluation that includes more than, like, what this test says, you will make the right choice.
Grace, thank you seriously so much for coming. I know that everyone who listens to this podcast is going to walk away a smarter person, and so thank you for taking time out of your busy week to answer all of our questions and just being you, honestly, because it was so fun to see you here, and I'm really glad that you came.
Thank you again for having me. I hope I was helpful to future clinicians, and I genuinely can't wait to learn more from the next generation, because this field is ever-changing, and I'm sure in 2 years I'm going to have a lot more to say about past Grace. So can't wait to learn from you guys.
Well, we can have you. All right, and with that, we are going to go ahead and wrap up our discussion about Grace's experience with bilingual service delivery and assessment. One last time, I want to thank both of you for being here today. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. And Grace, it was great to hear a little bit more about your day-to-day as a multilingual SLP. Thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you.
And for everyone who tuned into this episode, thank you for listening, and we hope we'll catch you on the next one.
For further information or podcast ideas you'd like to share with us, please reach out at 918-631-2504. And remember, communication is not just about words, it's about understanding, empathy, and connection. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep communicating.